Welcome, everyone. My name is Steve Mantis, and I am the session lead today, representing the DWC Steering Committee. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our session on designing public policy for persons with a disability, the Canada Disability Benefit, and future options. We're real excited about this. This is timely. The Canada Disability Benefit is in the House of Commons right now, being debated. Public hearings have just been completed, and we've got some experts to comment on that, and then followed by folks thinking actually beyond that and what else we need. I want to introduce Jonathan Marchand, who will be moderating the session today. Welcome, Jonathan, and over to you.
All right, thank you, Steve. So, yeah, my name is Jonathan Marchand. I'm the person with a disability. You will learn a bit about me, a bit more about me later. Today on this panel, our first two presenters will be John Stapleton and Yvonne Yuan, followed by Michael Kendrick and Bruce Toniadi, who I will introduce later. Now, John Stapleton is a writer, instructor, and a former Innovation Fellow with the Metcalfe Foundation. He worked for the Ontario government for 28 years in the areas of social assistance policy and operations, and was research director for the Task Force on Modernizing Income Security for Working-Age Adults in Toronto. John teaches on public policy for community advocates and is extensively published in the local and national media. Yvonne Yuan is a public policy analyst at Open Policy Ontario, a social policy consultancy located in Scarborough. She is committed to policy analysis in small geographies and progressive policy advocacy in general. Over the last 2 years, Yvonne worked extensively on the design of a new Canada Disability Benefit. So over to you, Yvonne and John.
Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. No matter which time zone we are in, let's acknowledge that we all live on Indigenous land. Before we start, here's a brief background for our presentation. The proposed Canada Disability Benefit, the CDB, intends to supplement working-age Canadians with disability. However, until now, we're still unaware of the program's essential details that affect who might be able to receive this benefit, what the amount might be, and how it might fit in with existing programs. With these questions in mind, my colleague and I will be discussing the CDB from a benefit designer perspective. Mainly, how should a benefit unit be designed? Because of the time limits, we will be going through each slide briefly, and our goal is to invite further discussion. In short, the federal government must solve a contradiction in policy principles respecting the design of the CDB. This dilemma is created by many causes, mainly because of the competing principles in social program purposes, the shifting focuses on meeting family needs and enhancing individual rights, as well as the different definitions of the benefit unit in existing programs. The issues are complicated by multiple systems and roles at all government levels and in the private sector. We present 4 options in response to this issue, and we'll discuss each of them in the following in the further slides. So in short, our recommendation is that the federal government should implement a smart hybrid model, incorporating all major features of a single base benefit unit while recognizing elements of family need by harmonizing benefit with other disability incomes at the federal, provincial, and territorial levels. So where we are right now. Bill C-22, after Bill C-35 was called off due to the federal election, was introduced again in June 2nd, 2022. It is now halfway through the legislature process, but like I said before, we still don't know what is the important details of the benefit of the program design. We should be noted that there are no changes in Bill C-22 from C-35. So the definition, one issue relates to the definition of the benefit unit. In terms of the determination or the definition of the benefit unit, the Act states that the government intends to borrow from the experience of seniors and child benefits, implying that the benefit unit might be designed in accordance with family needs, in other words, a family-based unit. In the throne speech that first introduced the CDB, it is clearly stated that the federal government intends to follow the model of the Guaranteed Income Supplement, the GIS. However, the federal government also promised to include gender-based plus analysis, the GBA plus, in the departmental decision-making processes and future planning initiatives. From the perspective of GBA plus analysis, it will require that a new CDB should be available to men and women with disabilities in their own right. In other words, GBA plus is consistent with an individual, a single-based benefit unit. The GIS, the model that the federal government intends to follow, on the other hand, has a family-based benefit structure and considers family resources in the determination of the benefit. Accordingly, a GIS-based Canadian disability benefit design may be seen as contradicting a crucial design parameter central to a GBA plus analysis. We also discussed that stated that there are competing principles underlies the benefit unit determination. In short, the values that guide real-world policies in most Western countries relates to our shared heritages, which in Canada are enshrined in Section 7 of the Charter of Rights: life, liberty, and security of the person. Accordingly, there is a strong relationship between democratic principles and how benefit programs define the benefit unit. On the other hand, for low-income families, a single benefit unit does not take into account the needs of the recipient's family. It means that if the federal CDB adopts a single benefit unit, income assistance, social assistance, benefit payments would need to be continued for approximately 300,000 low-income children, spouses, and adult children and social assistance across Canada. I now hand it over to my colleague, John Stapleton, to further explain.
Thanks very much, Yvonne. And just take a look at this slide. We cannot really get any direction from what we have now. CPP has a single benefit unit along with veterans, but CPP survivors benefits of war veterans give benefits to a single person, but then also give some small benefits to spouses and other dependents. EI sickness is single, but the Canada Workers Benefit for Disability is a family-based unit. The RDSP is single, the disability tax credit is single, but the GIS that the government says it's going to use from the throne speech is a family-based definition. Personal income taxation is concurrent hybrid. You're single for some purposes, that is when you're taxed, and you're a family for other purposes, i.e. when you're going to get refundable credits. So for the government, it's heads we win and tails you lose. Workers' compensation is a single base, but there's some family support. Ontario Disability Support Program, of course, is a family-based unit, which they are all across Canada, except for Alberta, that has a single-based hybrid in the AGE program. Disability insurance is family-based. Next slide, please, Yvonne. So when we look at the costs of this, we know that if the government does respect the GBA plus, and remember, we're mostly talking about women here who have lower income, and GBA plus, of course, supports the whole idea of someone, of a woman being able to get a benefit in her own right, not being dependent on the income of her spouse. So without considering family income, the caseloads of the CDB will increase as the income of spouses would not being taken into account, but we don't have the capacity or the ability to estimate the additional costs in this regard. Next slide, please. So when we try to look at the roles of the federal and provincial territorial government under our constitution, it's clear that the province have enumerated and non-enumerated roles here. And in 1867, there were no income security programs, so we can't really look to the Constitution. Next slide, please. And so if we look at existing programs, we looked at, we have 10 major disability income programs in place, all of which have differing definitions of benefit units. Some are single-based, some are family-based, and they go back and forth, and some of them are hybrids. So decisions as to whether the existing programs should change or rely on the eligibility and the definition of disability and program parameters that will be in place for a new CDB, all yet to be made. Next slide, please. So what about existing programs? Should they change or stay the same? So if the CDB acts as a single base benefit top up to a monthly benefit, then all programs could remain the same, and income assistance would perform their extended role in meeting family needs. So in other words, we'd have provincial social assistance that would continue to take care of those 300,000 families, spouses. And then at the same time, we'd have a single base family unit for the single person. But however, if a family-based unit is chosen, then income assistance as we know it could be folded into the CDB if the benefits are adequate. So again, some will argue for that. But to some, the latter would be a measure of true reform based on anti-poverty principles, while for others favoring the GBA plus analysis, which the government says it's committed to, might be seen as a clear policy loss. So we're really on the horns of a dilemma. So 16, the news release clearly said that the CDB would supplement and not replace. So what does that mean? On to 17, thanks. Therefore, if a single benefit unit is adopted for the new CDB, CPPD is largely in accord with the single benefit unit, as CPP itself is a single base benefit unit. We don't take into the spouse's income. The spouse could be a millionaire, male or female. However, CPPD and Veterans Program also provide family-based benefits. It would be a bad design approach to offset family-based benefits against a single base benefit. So in other words, we can't say we're going to take, when the minister says we're going to offset other programs, if we had a single base benefit, we wouldn't want them to offset or claw back the family portion. Accordingly, any spousal benefits paid by CPP and Veterans Affairs should not be offset against the CDB. So that's a consequential amendment there. So the decision, the government of Canada has an important decision to make respecting the benefit unit and can adopt a single benefit unit approach that supports feminist analysis, that supports the GBA plus framework, or it can follow the traditional GIS approach that sees family need as paramount. Made also possible to design a hybrid model, both inside and outside the new CDB. Next slide, please. The smart hybrid model that we're proposing is to have a single base benefit unit. To move people with disabilities out of poverty, the government should implement a smart hybrid program incorporating all major features of a single base benefit unit so that a woman, a spouse, would not have to depend on her partner. This is the most important side, while recognizing elements of family need, because we know that people are on income assistance right now and that their spouses and children. We don't simply cut them out of the whole of the things. So the smart hybrid model would keep the family-based benefits for the families where we're paying now, and should adopt an adequate single benefit unit for the new CDB. We have several options, and please read through our 70-page slides presentation that goes into this in great detail, while utilizing existing social assistance and meet the needs of recipients with dependents. So that's it for us. Thank you very much. And we'll turn it back over to Jonathan. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, John and Yvonne. Now I will tell you a bit more about myself before I introduce the other panelists. I'll share some slides. So I'm 46 years old. I'm an activist and an advocate for people with disabilities. I am a senior network engineer. I work extensively in Quebec and in Australia. I'm a survivor of institutionalization and euthanasia because of the lack of support to live in the community. I need 24-hour assistance around the clock because I use a ventilator to breathe. I'm the co-chair of Every Canadian Counts, a co-founder of and chair of Co-op Assist, which is a Quebec cooperative for independent living. Now, I spent about 11 years of my life into an institution, a long-term care facility in Quebec. I had to fight very hard to get out of that place. And it's actually what I experience is what the majority of people with severe disability experience in this country, because there's a chronic lack of support to live in the community. And just to illustrate how bad it is in those places, uh, you got no choice or control over where you live, how you live, and with whom you live in those places. You got no choice or say or who touches your body to provide you the assistance you need to keep on living. You get next to no family life, and you cannot work and invest in your future. Everything is taken away from you, basically. You're subjected to violence and systemic abuse on a daily basis. You lose your citizenship. You become an object of care and profit. For most, there's no way out of those places. It is really the final destination. And now, sadly, medical assistance in dying is seen as a solution for us. Now, needless to say, I was not having it. I wanted to get out of that place very bad. So I lobbied the government for many years to create a pilot project so that me and others could quit the long-term care facility and live in the community with self-directed personal assistance. The government was not hearing us. So during the pandemic, at the peak of the pandemic, about 2 years now ago, I went and camped out. I escaped my facility and I camped out in a cage in front of the National Assembly in Quebec City. And I asked the government to hear us and implement a pilot project so that all people with disabilities could one day live freely in the community like every other citizen. I slept in a hospital bed in my cage for 5 days, um, and I spent 5 nights over there. It was really difficult. I had many people and many friends who helped me out, and we mobilized around this idea that people with disabilities are just ordinary people, ordinary citizens who want to be included in society. And the media really helped push our message out, and we were able to negotiate with the government for a pilot project. I've been working with the government for quite a while now to create something, but sadly, the government reneged on their promise to create a pilot project. But I managed to get out of that place and to create a precedent because in Quebec's history, no one has 24-hour assistance to live in their own apartments. And now I'm helping others get out of the facility and help others avoid the same fate. But it's very small scale and it's not recognized yet. So now I live in my own apartment. I work as a network engineer and I have an active social life like everyone else. I got around the clock self-directed personal assistance, and that's what made it possible. I can hire my own assistant. I can choose how the assistance is provided. I got control and choice over my life. But I'm on parole, as living in the community with the necessary support is not a right in Canada. It can be taken away from you at any time. So the work to cement what we achieved is ongoing. Now the Accessibility Act and the Disability Benefit are welcome additions, but it won't enable us to avoid or quit institutions and to be full citizens included into Canadian society. So, a national disability insurance program is necessary to address individual needs and their families, because it's about people with disabilities and their families, and we need often extensive support over our lifetime to keep on living in the community. Right now, there's an institutional bias in our system. Most people with severe disabilities end up in institutions because that's where the funding is going. So now I will introduce um, Michael and Bruce 2080, and they got a presentation for us. So Michael Kendrick is a PhD. He's a Canadian PhD, independent international consultant in human services, in aging, disability, and mental health in several dozen countries. His involvements and writings include leadership, service quality, the creation of safeguards for vulnerable persons, intentional personal networks, social integration, innovation, values advocacy, the role of alliances, evaluation, alternative to bureaucracy, supported decision making, personalized approaches to supporting people with complex needs, and reform in the human service field, amongst others. He has independently evaluated many hundreds of services and spoken to tens of thousands of people. And Professor Bruce 2080 is a disability reformer, economist, one of the key architects of Australia's National Disability Insurance Scheme, the NDIS, and was the inaugural chair of the National Disability Insurance Agency from 2013 and 2016. He is currently the executive chair and director of the Melbourne Disability Institute at the University of Melbourne and co-chair of independent review of the NDIS. He began his career in the Australian Treasury and has held many non-executive roles, including president of Philanthropy Australia from 2006 to 2013. He is the father of 3 adult sons, 2 of whom have disabilities. So now over to you, Michael and Bruce.
Jonathan, thank you very much for that very warm introduction, and it's terrific to be able to speak to you today from Australia about future options for supporting people with disability in Canada, based on our Australian experience. Jonathan, your story is immensely moving, but now in Australia, we're well on the way to having over 500,000 people able to exercise the sort of control and choice that you described. So if I could just get the next slide, please. So what I'm planning to do today is to give you an overview of the NDIS, its vision, key features, talk to you about some of the reform principles that underpinned its introduction in Australia, why it was needed, give you a brief outline of the Productivity Commission inquiry a decade ago, which led to the scheme, give a brief description of its features, eligibility, benefits, the campaign in Australia, which was called Every Australian Counts, and so mirrors your Every Australian Counts campaign, and then talk about the latest data, the review of the NDIS that I'm now co-chairing, and then some concluding remarks. So we could just go to the next slide. The NDIS is a world-leading reform. It's truly unique in the way it frames disability in an insurance, investment and economic framework. It's not just a social policy reform. And as emphasised by Jonathan, what it gives to people with disability is control and choice over their lives, and at the same time seeks to build the capacity of communities. And because it's being developed in an insurance framework, we are now collecting the best data on disability anywhere in the world. And we're now starting to use that data to refine and improve the scheme and through the review that I'm now co-chairing. So if we could just go to the next slide. Key to the NDIS is its underlying principles. So it is based on human rights and the UN Convention of Rights of Persons with Disability to participate in society. It's designed to be equitable and fair. So supports are based on need. So someone like Jonathan, who's got high support needs, gets a much higher package than someone with lower support needs. It's designed to be effective, efficient, empower people with disability, build family, social and community capital, to be sustainable from a budgetary or fiscal policy perspective, and to ensure that it is always supported by the community, which it is in Australia. This is now supported by all political parties and at all levels of government. And then finally, it was designed to fit into our existing policy and government structures. So if I could just go to the next slide. The reason we needed an NDIS in Canada was that we recognised through a pension review in 2008 that pensions and benefits are insufficient to meet the lifetime needs of people with disability, especially those with very high support needs. So in Australia, our NDIS sits above or is an addition to our equivalent of your disability benefit. In Australia, we call that the disability support pension. The second need was that people with disability support needs of people with disability have been rising due to some very powerful demographic forces. People with disability were living much longer and generally outliving their parents due to better medical treatments. At the same time, the capacity of families to provide informal care was declining due to increasing female participation, smaller and more dispersed families, and increased marital breakdowns, especially in families with disabled children. Prior to the introduction of the NDIS, the support system for people with disability was literally in crisis, increasingly focused more and more on those people in crisis as their family supports disappeared. And the Productivity Commission in its report a decade ago described our system as in a death spiral. And I would argue that support systems around the world, including in Canada, are also facing a very similar crisis to the one we faced in Australia. So the next slide, please. So the Productivity Commission in its report described our then system as underfunded, unfair, fragmented and inefficient, and so recommended the introduction of the NDIS and noted that it would add significantly to GDP. The other point to note was there was an OECD report at about the same time, which found that 45% of Australians were living at or below the poverty line, which is the worst of any OECD country. So the NDIS is partly designed to lift people with disability and their families out of poverty. And it's meant to be, or is designed to be, a major source of improved equity and fairness in our society. So to the next slide. So who's eligible for the NDIS? It's all Australian citizens under the age of 65 who have a significant and permanent disability. It includes people with intellectual, physical, sensory, and psychosocial disabilities, and also provides early intervention for children with significant development delay. And all of this is based on a functional assessment rather than medical diagnosis. And that, of course, is a much fairer way of determining need than a single medical diagnosis. Next slide, please. So the NDIS provides reasonable and necessary supports. It includes core supports to support activities of daily living. It actually provides capacity building, so invests in people with disability to improve their function, to enable them to participate in society, and also includes equipment such as wheelchairs. The benefits therefore help to support people with disability in their daily activities, accessing the community. And participants receive the funds so that they can purchase their support, so they are free to choose. And as I've mentioned, it works alongside our disability support pension, which is the equivalent of your Canadian disability benefit. The insurance-based approach seeks to maximise the lifetime opportunities of people with disability, to enable people to work like Jonathan's described, and to minimise their lifetime costs. It is, in fact, from an economic perspective, the most efficient and effective way of supporting people with disability, and all within a vision to maximise independence and social and economic participation. So next slide, please. So as part of the scheme, we do measure outcomes across the 8 domains listed there, and the outcomes are measured not just for participants, but also for the families. And this is, so it is really structured as an investment scheme, not just as a welfare scheme. So going to the next slide. The NDIS came about not due primarily to governments, but due to a community campaign called Every Australian Counts. The campaign, and I salute the campaign that you're running in Canada, is testament to the power of individuals to change society. So the Australian experience demonstrates that what you are trying to achieve can also can actually be done. And the key elements of our campaign were, first of all, achieving unity amongst people with disability, carers and service providers for the NDIS. Our selection of language was very important. It framed, so it described the old disability system as broken. And once that was accepted, then reform had to come. And the campaign name, which you've also chosen, evokes images of people with disability not counting. They need to be counted and are seen to be counted. And finally, thirdly, we used economic analysis as the principal framework for advocating for the scheme. Not just a social, we didn't frame it just as a social policy issue or a human rights issue. We framed it as an economic issue, and in Australia at least, most public policies are importantly shaped by their economic consequences. And then finally, we use technology and social media to link people up right across Australia in support of this scheme. And at critical times, there were emails, there were text messages being sent to our Prime Minister, to the leaders of our states, which are the equivalent of your provinces, to ensure that this scheme was introduced. Next slide, please. In Australia, people with disability are underrepresented in our workforce. There are 2.1 million people with disability of working age, which is 12% of Australia's working age population. But when you look at their employment experience, it's very different to those without disability, with employment rates and labour force participation rates lagging 30% behind the Australians without disability. And this gap has in fact widened over the last couple of decades. In the 2010 study that I referred to earlier from the OECD, ranked Australia in the bottom 1/3 of OECD countries in terms of employment with disability. And I note that Canada is at a similar level to Australia. So there's an enormous opportunity through the NDIS in Australia to improve employment outcomes for people with disability, which is not just good for them, but it's actually good for society, as Jonathan has demonstrated in his personal story. So let me now go to the next slide, which just gives you a few key statistics on the NDIS. As I said, there are more than 500,000 participants in the scheme. 334,000 of them are receiving support for the first time. So it gives you some indication of how needed this scheme was in Australia, how hidden disability was. Since the scheme began, there's been significant increases in social participation, in employment of people with disability, in improved employment outcomes for parents, and also in improved health and well-being. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we now have an independent review of the NDIS underway. It's nearly 10 years since the scheme began, and as well as being transformational, the scheme has been disruptive. We've now got an enormous amount of data on which we can assess the effectiveness of the scheme, and that's what the review that I'm co-chairing is designed to do. We report directly to the Minister for Disability in our federal government, but we also report to disability ministers in our state governments. The review is focusing on the issues listed there: the participant experience, improving the scheme's effectiveness and sustainability, attracting, building and retaining a capable workforce. Disability care and aged care is now the largest workforce sector in Australia and has grown very significantly due to the NDIS. We're also working on improving consumer information and deepening the markets that have emerged since the NDIS commenced, improving quality and safeguards, and ultimately improving outcomes for participants and their families, including social and economic participation. Just go to the next slide. The NDIS is a nation-building reform. It was led by people with disabilities and their families. It was a response to a perfect storm, and a perfect storm that I think is clearly developing in other Western countries, including in Canada. It's also more than a social reform because it reframes disability as a central economic and policy challenge for all governments. And today we stand in a position where the NDIS has the potential to be at the heart of the best disability system in the world, which embraces disability rights. And this is the aim of the NDIS review, which is underway. Our experience is that only an individualised scheme like the NDIS, based on a social insurance model, can provide the supports which are necessary for those who experience significant lifetime disabilities, and so can support optimal lifetime outcomes in terms of economic and social participation. And just to answer Steve's question that was in the chat, it is essentially an individual benefit, but it then does take account of the capacity of families to provide informal care, and so recognises that a quality life is not just based on government benefits. A quality life is based on loving relationships, on friendships, and also on sufficient benefits. So I would argue it is primarily an individual benefit scheme, but with an allowance for families to play a part in the lives of those people, of the participants within the scheme. So thank you very much. I look forward to participating in the Q&A.
All right, thank you, Bruce. Now, Michael.
Now, the example from Australia shows that we've had significant progress in the last several generations throughout the world on improving the life conditions of persons with disabilities in almost all countries. Many of those opportunities and innovations could occur in Canada, or have already occurred in Canada. And so Canadians are aware of these progressive developments, or could become aware of it. So it's important that people do understand that it is possible to make progress. Next slide. Now, just in the Canadian context, just to indicate that there has been actual progress in Canada in terms of overall social inclusion of persons with disabilities within their communities. This has included a greater participation in community generally across the country. There's a growing interest in looking to even yet more progress in Canada. And hence it brings us to the moment we're in right now, where we're looking around for, to answer the question, how to build on the progress that's been made and to see if we can advance it yet further. Next slide. In Canada, like in many countries, a lot of this has been generated bottom up from initiatives in the various provinces at a community level and provincial level. And this does indicate that there's a strong commitment in Canada for progress in terms of the lives of persons with disabilities. It is, in a sense, not a new thing. It's trying to build upon what's already been created that's been helpful. But the clear implication is that there's still yet much to be done in Canada that we're not yet attempting. Next. Now, the provincial and local governments often dominate the support for people with disabilities, much like that was the case in Australia. But it does highlight that in this respect, Canada needs a new wave of federal or national leadership if we're to make the kind of progress that's been made in countries such as Australia. So that's why we're focusing really on where the way forward may be at the federal level. Next. And as Bruce has been describing, the National Disability Insurance Scheme was, if you like, kind of created from scratch. It wasn't in place as it is today. It blended with what was already on the ground, but it did break new ground in important ways. So a similar question exists at the national level in Canada, where the federal government hasn't thus far provided all of the leadership it can provide from that level. And similarly, at a local and provincial level, there's still many unfulfilled sort of potentials. But today we're focusing a little bit on the federal or national potentials. Next slide. Now, whatever the merits and limitations of the Australian NDIS, and people in Australia would say that it's a wonderful initiative, but they too are always looking for the question of how it might be improved. In Canada, it's pretty obvious that depending on where you are in Canada, you may get a better or worse form of support from your government, your provincial government, so that in this sense, not all Canadians are equal. A lot depends on the province you're in and what that province has to offer. Hence, like in Australia, which also had a state-based system prior to NDIS, we're really needing to look at what could be created in Canada that might be inspired by the NDIS, that would be a made in Canada version of it, but that would have the effect of leveling the playing field for all people with disabilities across Canada to move ahead in common, no matter where you live in the country. Next. So there is then a role for the Canadian national government, and it will, to move ahead, it needs to have some kind of consensus from across Canada as to what should the future look like, what could we borrow from Australia and other countries, as well as build upon what's already in place in the country. So the Australian Federal Innovation, which had a very good name, that every Australian counts, this we could mimic ourselves by saying that every Canadian counts. And so we can't have benefits in one province that aren't available in another. Otherwise, obviously, not every Canadian counts. And next slide. Now, there is a considerable potential to make such an effort at equity, fairness, and leadership a priority of both the Canadian and provincial federal governments. The cooperation between federal and provincial governments is not unknown, but it's certainly need to strengthen it at this point if we're going to make these kinds of progress. So the Every Canadian Counts sort of initiative then would be the basis for trying to work out what this national model would look like. Much like in Australia, they didn't start with a known answer. They had to create it and to appraise different ways to think about it and to move ahead. But in the end, they did make enormous progress and continues to do that. So I think that's a very inspiring role model for us in Canada.
Well, thank you, Michael.